want to congratulate Perak Academy for getting, two of the top world commentators on China, Kishore Mahbubani, who's also a million bookseller, and now Martin Jakes. It really is a pleasure and honor for me to introduce Martin. As you said, we miss each other at Bristol, but he was a lecturer, I was a student. Martin actually should need no introduction. He's the author of the global bestseller, When China Rules the World, The End of the Western World and the Birth of a New Global Order. And that was published in 2009, and nobody can dispute how prescient it is, this book is. I reread it. I have a copy personally signed by Martin. That was early in 2010 when I got it, 2009 when I got it, but it still reads very fresh. Now, this book has been translated into 15 languages and sold over 500,000, okay? The second edition published by Penguin was published in 2012. And just for the record, his TED Talk on how to understand China has had over 4 million views. So that's a blockbuster, if anything. Now, Martin has just stepped down as a senior fellow at the Department of Politics and International Studies at Cambridge University. He's visiting professor at Tsinghua University, Beijing, Fudan University in Shanghai, and the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in US. Martin is a brilliant academic career, taught at Renminbi University, Aichi University, and Ritsumeikan University in Japan. He also taught at Bristol and has a doctorate from King's College, Cambridge. Now, as a journalist, his real title is just journalist, a writer, as well as academic. He is columnist for The Guardian, a former deputy editor of the Independent newspaper, and founder of the think tank Demos. His Malaysian connection, which is why we're so honored to have him here, is his late wife, Harinda Veria, who was educated at Assunta School in PJ. Now, in her memory, he founded Harinda Veria Trust, which supports girls from deprived backgrounds with education at Assunta and elsewhere. Now, he lives in London with his son, Ravi, who is studying or may have finished already at Stanford University. As I can say, nothing can describe Martin better than himself and what he's going to talk about, the great disjuncture. Over to you, Martin.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you very much to the Perak Academy for inviting me to speak to you this evening, although it's not this evening here in London, I must add. I just say it's always special for me to do something for Malaysia because, as Andrew's explained, the connection between me and Malaysia is in the heart. And so thank you very much for that. Well, how to understand the growing tensions between China and the United States? How to characterize the new era, which started in 2016 with the election of Trump? Is it a new Cold War, as it is frequently described? How long will it last? How will it end? These are some of the questions that I want to address during my talk. Now, it started with the election of Trump in November 2016. But a shift in US thinking was already evident during the several years beforehand. Now, the relationship of stability and benign cooperation, which had characterized China and the US between 1972 and 2016, was based on two underlying assumptions. First, China would never pose an economic challenge to the United States, the great economic hegemon of the time. And you might think this was not entirely unreasonable, given that in 1980, the Chinese economy was, just to remind ourselves, just 5% of the size of the US economy. Secondly, the other assumption was that as China modernized, it would westernize. And in due course, it would become a Western style political system and society. And I would add to that, the assumption was that if this did not happen, then the Chinese regime would implode. By 2016, it was abundantly clear to everyone, really, that these two assumptions had been profoundly wrong. In 2014, according to the World Bank International Comparison Program, China overtook the size of the American economy, measured by GDP according to primary purchasing power. And also, it is also very clear that far from the political system and the political regime in China weakening or declining or its future in doubt, on the contrary, it has gone from strength to strength and delivered, one might add, remarkable successes. So the American attitude shifted from seeing China as an opportunity, as a, in some senses, partner. The US came to see China as a threat to its position as the global hegemon. And it was not just Trump. It was a bipartisan shift. It was Biden. This was consensual. It was across America. And the reason is, I think, for that is because America believes itself to be the number one in the world, and it cannot conceive of not being number one in the world. It's, if you like, part of its DNA. Now, a note here, and by the way, I would add that this attitude has, if anything, got stronger. I mean, some people describe it as a displacement anxiety, and even, as we can see, a significant paranoia is now evident in the United States in its attitude towards China. Now, I think it's important to stress at this point that the reason for the shift was because of American decline and the rise of China. In other words, the shift in the American position towards China was essentially a defensive one to try and stymie and forestall China's rise and maintain America's primacy. Now, let us remind ourselves at this point about the key features of the Cold War between 1947 and 1989, between the United States and the USSR. First, there's no question at all that at the end of the Second World War and at the time of the beginning of the Cold War in 1947, the United States was on the rise, was the dominant power in the world, and was full, if you like, of ambition and creativity in the manner in which it addressed the post-war world. Compared with that, the Soviet Union had been, as you will recall, shattered by the war, 20 million people killed. It was in a state of, well, large parts of it had been effectively destroyed. Second characteristic of the Cold War, the world was divided into two blocks. The United States on the one hand, the Soviet Union on the other, NATO on the one hand, Warsaw Pact on the other. Never the twain shall meet. They lived in separate worlds. They barely traded together. There was no investment flows between them. They were estranged from each other. They occupied, if you like, two different universes. Third point, it was very unequal. The Soviet Union never got to a point where it was more than 60% the size of the American economy. And by and large, towards the end, it was less than that. So it was, let's say, around half or a bit more than half the size of the United States. Fourthly, fourth characteristic was that really the Cold War took primarily two key forms. One, military. This was the nuclear era, the spread of the nuclear bomb, the nuclear weapons. And the two, and probably the most dominant form of all in this context was the arms race. Two of the most important moments in this history were both around the military question, if you like. One was Berlin, the Berlin crisis, and the other was the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1961. And the other main form of the Cold War was ideological. I mean, these were two systems which had entirely different views. And one wanted to effectively undermine and destroy the other. It was like a kind of Manichaean conflict, if you like, to the very bitter end. They had no common ground, essentially. Now compare the Cold War that I've just described with the present conflict. First of all, very different from the US and the USSR. The United States has been in decline. Well, we can argue about when it starts, but I'm going to choose 1980. But it's become abundantly clear since the turn of the century, and especially since 2008, that the United States is in, actually, historically speaking, quite rapid economic decline. And on the other hand, we can see, again, very clearly that China has been on the economic rise in an extraordinary way since 1978. And not only transforming itself, but in the process also, partly because of its size, remaking the world, creating new institutions, and so on. Secondly, unlike, again, the Cold War, China is deeply integrated in the global economy. It's not like the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was, as I said, existing in a hermetically sealed compartment away from the United States and vice versa. China is deeply integrated in the global economy. In fact, I would argue that it is in many ways, not every way, but in many ways, more integrated in the global economy than the United States is. As you know, China is by far the biggest trading country in the world. I think it's about 140 countries in the world count China now as its biggest trading partner. In fact, China is more integrated in many respects in the global economy than the United States is, which actually is not a very major trading power and has become, and America's trade has become less rather than more important over recent decades. Third point, unlike the Soviet Union, China is more or less, in many respects, the United States economic equal. As I mentioned, the figure about 2014, the sort of moment when it overtook the United States economy in size. Today, by IMF figures, China's economy is 20% bigger. And it's projected that sometime after 2030, some people say 2030, I think that's probably a bit optimistic or pessimistic, depending on your point of view, China's economy will be something like twice the size of that of the United States. And the fourth characteristic of this present conflict is that it is not primarily military and it's not primarily ideological. I don't mean there aren't some kind of military contest going on, of course there is, but it's not really defining in the way that the military conflict was in the Cold War. And one of the key reasons for this is that China has never seen itself in this kind of light. It spends far less on the military than the United States. It's increasing, but it's well short, and it has no ambitions of expansion, of territorial expansion. So it's very different from the experience of the previous Cold War. And ideologically, the divide that was so important in the Cold War is not really true in the same way. I mean, you know, there are ideological differences. No one's arguing that there aren't any, but they're not so singular and important as they were in the Cold War. I mean, you know, China's approach to Chinese society, China's reform period and so on, has been to emphasize learning from elsewhere, especially of the West, and certainly including the United States, and also a very strong element of pragmatism. I mean, maybe this is best summed up by Deng Xiaoping's expression, you know, it doesn't matter whether the cat is white or black as long as it catches the mice. In other words, if you need the market, then let's have the market. If the market can deliver, and we'll have the state, you know, for various forms, for other reasons, so on. This is very different, of course, from the experience of the Soviet Union. Now, there are two things I want to emphasize here. One, there is talk of decoupling. I think that the possibility of a fundamental decoupling between the United States and China is so unlikely as to be probably impossible. It's just that China is so hugely integrated. There are so many countries in the world that depend on China, that are linked to China, that it would be politically and economically impossible for this to be achieved. Now, there are elements of decoupling, of course. The most important example is in technology, especially digital technology, especially the field of semiconductors, where Trump, and now Biden's picked up the same ball and is running with it, to try and sever any relationship between China and US technology, whether it's in US firms or Taiwanese firms or Korean firms and so on. This was probably one of the more successful bits of Trump's assault on China. But in many areas, this will not happen. I mean, at the highest levels of technology, maybe, but not in lower levels, particularly where it affects national security. I mean, it's interesting, by the way, that Trump, if you recall, tried to ban TikTok, and he ran into a lot of trouble. And it's interesting that that had not, as yet, been re-raised as a possibility. Clearly, TikTok doesn't in any way pose a serious national security problem, although one never knows these days exactly how wide the net will be cast by the United States in relation to what national security, what constitutes national security. So in most economic areas, I don't think that we're likely to see that process of decoupling going very far. This is a world this is an integrated world, and although it's under assault and it's being undermined in some ways, it's not going to be. China's not going to be excised by a huge wave of comprehensive decoupling from the global economy. It's just not going to happen. And it's worth noting, by the way, that since Trump started this assault on China, it's worth noting that US-China trade has increased over the 5 years since then. And if you look at financial integration, then that is now that has been expanding over the last several years a lot. And so in many ways, or in key respects, there's also growing integration between economic integration or financial integration, certainly between China and the United States. So that's the first point I want to emphasize. That process of decoupling has severe limits, and I don't think it'll go beyond those, and it'll be restricted to various, the sort of digital technology, high technology with national security connotations. Now, the second point I want to make is another emphasize is that the world is not divided into two blocks, and it will not be divided into two blocks. This is very, very different from the Cold War. In the Cold War, the world was, as I tried to explain, divided fundamentally into two blocks. But if you look at the situation today, I mean, the kind of, well, let's take China, for example. China does have relationships with many countries in the world, but they are economic relationships. It's got many agreements, partnership agreements and so on, comprehensive strategic agreements with lots of countries. But I'm hard pressed to think of one which has any kind of military or security content. That is not how China has gone about its rise. Perhaps the best metaphor for China's concept of its relationships with other countries is the Belt and Road Program. Now, everyone knows the Belt and Road Program is not a security operation. It's very typical of China today, which is the emphasis on investment, economic growth, and infrastructure. And so that's not a block. It's you could describe it as an economic network, if you like. That would not be incorrect. But it's certainly not a military bloc or a politico-military bloc in the style of the Cold War. And so I think that we're, from the Chinese side, we're not in anything like a kind of Warsaw Pact scenario that you had in the Cold War. You've got to think differently about the new situation. It's not the same at all. And the other element, the other side of the coin, of course, is the United States. Now, I think it's fair to say that the kind of alliances that the United States built during the Cold War, most notably NATO, CETO, CENTO, so on, these were essentially military alliances, and they required a very loyalty, and they were tightly organized, and there was it was one side against the other mentality. Now, I don't think that America can call on that kind of loyalty anymore, apart from a very small number of countries. And it's not going to be able to command the same kind of discipline amongst those that it describes as allies. I mean, China never uses the expression allies because it hasn't really got any allies. I don't accept North Korea as a serious candidate for this, although there is a treaty agreement dating back to the Korean War. But China doesn't have any, and the United States has lots. But that doesn't mean that you've got the same kind of disciplines that existed during the Cold War on the American side. Indeed, what I would emphasize is some ways how relatively contingent and weak the relationship is between the United States and those who it regards as its allies. You take the case of Europe. I mean, there was a very interesting survey recently conducted by the Economic Council for Foreign Relations across 11 European countries. And basically, the majority view was that what had happened with Trump in America, which people were overwhelmingly against Trump, and the other Europeans, marked a permanent change in American politics. And if they were asked if there was a conflict between China and the United States, which side Europe should be on, and overwhelmingly they said it shouldn't be on either side. In other words, Europeans wanted to stand aloof from any such conflict. And it's worth a while also recalling the words of Angela Merkel, the long-standing Chancellor of Germany, and of course to retire next month, who said, with Biden pushing for loyalty of the West and a kind of common alliance, she said, I'm against blocks. I don't want to be in one block rather than another. To me, blocks are the wrong way of moving forward, and it would be wrong for Germany to be part of any such system. And the thing is that, of course, Germany is the most important country in Europe. Or take ASEAN. I mean, ASEAN is a very good example, I think, of this question, because at the ASEAN 10, I mean, there are military elements, of course, in ASEAN. Thailand's got an old agreement with the US, military agreement, and Philippines, of course, has American bases and so on. But actually, what's really striking in the ASEAN countries is how the extent to which they remain very independent-minded and unwilling to express allegiance to either of the great powers in this sense. Though it's worth noting that of the 10 members of ASEAN, I would guess 8 of which, including the Philippines, lean in some degree or other towards China rather than the United States. Although, of course, the reason for this, understandably, has been the sheer economic importance of China to the ASEAN countries, indeed to China as well, because ASEAN-Chinese trade is now larger than China's trade with either the United States or with Europe. So we're not moving towards a very segregated, bifurcated world that we had during the period of the Cold War. So what conclusions do I draw from this? I draw the conclusion that this is not a rerun of the Cold War, and it will not become a rerun of the Cold War. I mean, in the West, it's frequently described, in fact, it's most commonly described, probably, as a new Cold War, certainly in the United States. But it seems to me this is perhaps wistful thinking on the part of the US, because they can nostalgically reflect back to the Cold War as a conflict which they overwhelmingly won by a knockout blow, namely the implosion of and collapse of the Soviet Union. But we're not seeing a rerun. This is something different. This conflict is something different. So what is it? Well, I would describe it as something like this. It is a comprehensive competition between two very different countries about which modernity is most applicable to and appropriate for the 21st century. Between two countries that are very different. A nation state that has dominated the last 75 years, but is now in decline, or a civilization state rooted in very different values and with a very long history, and which is very much on the rise. So what are the areas of this competition? Well, they're pretty straightforward, and you could add to my list, but they're economic, they are about technology, the tech war, particularly digital technology. They are around the theme of governance, which I shall come to again in a moment. They are around living standards. They're about social cohesion, about inclusivity, about sustainability in all sorts of different ways, including, of course, global warming. Now, let me single out just two of these to elaborate a little on. I mean, one I've already mentioned, but I'll come back to because I think that the tech war is going to be very important because it's sort of digital technology has become, if you like, in some senses, the commanding height of the economy and with great ramifications, as we all know, for society and for culture. And so I think this is going to be a key area of competition between the United States and China. I would say that the United States, by and large, in the main, is still leading in this field, and certainly in the field of really high spec semiconductors. China is at least, I would think, 5 years behind the United States, maybe more, but certainly significant. Now, the second area is governance, and I think this is very interesting. For a very long time, throughout the post-war period, China was China was regarded as not in the ring compared with the West in terms of the quality of its governance, the effectiveness of its governance, the legitimacy of its governance. I mean, this was an area which the West regarded, if you like, as its calling card. Western democracy. How could anything be as good as or better than Western democracy? But I think if we stand back and look at the period of the last 30 years, we can see that a big sea change is now underway, which with very important implications. Firstly, understandably, because the West was the economic leader in the world, the dominant force in the world, it was regarded to be the leader in economic management, in economic governance. But of course, there's been this underlying economic shift in the center of gravity from China, from the United States to China, especially since 2008. The financial crisis, I think, hugely damaged America's reputation for economic competence. You may remember that for many years, the United States, the West more generally, expected there to be a major economic crisis in China. This economic crisis never happened. Instead, it happened in the United States in 2008, the worst since 1931. And it's clear that the West has never recovered from that. In fact, I think if you look at the period since 1980 to the present day, the economic problems, the economic difficulties that face the West and especially the United States have grown steadily more serious. The second area is political competence. As I said, political governance. I mean, Western political systems were regarded, or certainly saw themselves to be, and were widely regarded across the world, I think, as superior to any others. I mean, I think if we had this discussion 10 years ago, there'd be quite a few people who still felt the same thing. And if we went back 20 years, then I think overwhelmingly people would probably think that. But we've seen, largely as a result of the financial crisis in 2008, growing discontent in the West about the governing institutions, about the political parties, about the prevailing political ideologies, and so on. And this came, of course, to a kind of climax in a way in 2016 with the election of Trump as president. And Trump's relationship with democracy and so on has been widely discussed, his ambiguous relationship with it. And the underlying problem in the United States has become one of growing polarization, fragmentation, and division. I mean, Biden is at the moment president. Who's going to follow Biden? Are we going to get Trump again? Or are we going to get someone like Trump again? None of us can be at all certain what the political future of the United States is going to be. And it was very interesting, I think, last January, but before that as well, leading American voices growing increasingly troubled and doubtful about the future of democracy in the United States. So, and then you compare that, of course, with China, and there's no question in my own mind that Chinese governance has been extraordinarily effective. I mean, to take a country to preside over an economic transformation, which I think can rightly be described as the greatest economic transformation in modern times, taking it from such a low ebb where the great majority of the population was extremely poor in such a short space of time, that is not easy. That requires huge statecraft and ability and constant reinvention. And the Chinese have been very, very good at reinventing China as a kind of process during the reform period. Now, the third example of governments I want to take is the pandemic. Now, I would argue that the pandemic has been the greatest test of governance since 1945. In fact, I would say that probably, other than war, it's difficult to think of anything that can be considered in the same way as a challenge to governance as the COVID-19. Now, without going into all the details, which I'm sure you're broadly familiar with, China did extraordinarily well. I mean, the present figures for the number of deaths in China is something below 4,600. And in contrast, I think it's the American figures now for deaths are over 600,000. And China's strategy, which rested on, it seems to me, two things, really, generally speaking. One is very effective government leadership. And secondly, a very powerful sense of social cohesion, social responsibility, social discipline, which I think, first and foremost, is rooted in a Confucian tradition. And then you contrast an absolute clear objective that China was going to accept zero virus in the country. And you contrast that with the United States, where you all know, I mean, under Trump, it was really a joke. I mean, you know, quack medicines, taking things which were completely unsuited to deal with any medical condition, and constant racist refrains about the Wuhan virus, the Kung flu, and all this kind of thing. It was a deliberate attempt to demonize China and the Chinese. But underlying the American approach, which has also been a problem in Europe as well, were two things. One, the economy versus life, which is more important. Now, in the Chinese case and other East Asian countries, especially those that come from the Confucian tradition, the approach was always to prioritize, or generally to prioritize, life against the economy. Or the Chinese position was deal with the pandemic first, more or less conquer it, and then open up the economy. And that's what the Chinese approach was, and it worked fantastically. I mean, it's true that in the early days, in January, there was clearly some missteps in China. There was clearly indecision about how serious it was and so on. But that's hardly surprising. I mean, China was on the front line in relation to this COVID-19. It couldn't look at any other country because the origins of this pandemic first of all appeared in China. But once it got hold of it, from the last week in January, China performed magnificently. And of course, by April, it's already, as a result of more or less getting on top of the virus and suppressing it, it was able to open up the economy. Now take the American approach. The American approach, again, apart from this Trump's idiocy, I would describe it as, there were two key arguments. One was on the economy versus life. The emphasis was the economy. The economy is more important. Don't have too many restrictions. It will hurt the growth of the economy, the economic prosperity, and so on. As a result, there was constant. Well, as a result, the pandemic really was quite shocking in terms of the number of deaths in the United States. And the other argument in the United States, again, very contrasting with China, was between the importance of the individual and individual freedom, individual liberty versus social measures, acting on behalf of society as a whole. And it's not surprising in an individualistic country like America that by and large, the dominant argument was the first, the dominant position was the first rather than the second, although it did vary significantly from state to state. And so I think that what we saw in the pandemic was really a brutal illustration in many ways of the effectiveness of Chinese governance in the face of a challenge like this compared with the United States. Europe was not as bad as the United States by and large, although the UK was left a huge amount to be desired. But it was certainly not on the same register as China and East Asia. Now, you may have been confused by the noise that the Americans have put up. I mean, there was the initial assault. I think initially Trump saw COVID-19 as a tremendous God-given gift to America because China had mucked it up. But of course, that became they had about a month of that, and then by March it was the pandemic had hit the West and was moving across the West. And I think then the American strategy was no longer simply, well, we'll discredit the China because it's messed up, because clearly China hadn't messed up. So then it became, it seems to me, essentially a strategy of distraction and deflection to try and demonize China in whatever way could be done. So there were the racist tropes that Trump used, and there was the argument, constant refrain about, or where, to what extent was China responsible for the origins, the lab leak, the call for an international team to go to China and investigate what the Chinese had been up to, and even the latest device is the Bloomberg's done a COVID-19 resilience ranking, and by an extraordinary feat of underhand thinking, United States is placed number one, despite the catastrophe of its handling of the pandemic. I mean, this is really desperate stuff, I think, it seems to me. So, so in terms of governance, I think that has been the big shift. I mean, a lot of people have known for some time that China economically has done really well, and the Chinese government has been extremely good at managing its economic rise. But what is new, I think, the new addition is COVID-19, and just how badly the United States handled it and how well China did in contrast. So to bring my remarks to a close, because I think my time's chasing after me. Well, first of all, questions I raised at the beginning. How will this conflict, when will this conflict end, and how will it end? Well, the period of stability in the relationship between 1972 and 2016 lasted 44 years. These things do not last a short time. They tend to go on for quite extended periods. The Cold War lasted 42 years. Now, I'm not predicting this necessarily anything like this, but I do think we're not in for, we've now had, 5 years of something like that. I would be surprised, frankly, if it's less than 20 years. It could be rather longer than that. But it will end. And it won't end like the Cold War. It's not, the Cold War ended, like a boxing match, if you like, with a knockout punch, as I said earlier. This is not going to end like that. I mean, this is a long struggle, which will have all, as I mentioned earlier, all sorts of elements to it, all sorts of stages in which it's fought, all kinds of different phases. But I think that I can't see really, if I reduced it to this, any other winner than China, because America is, for all the reasons, some of the reasons I've said and other reasons that I haven't said, I think that China will, as it has been for the last few decades, but especially the last 20, gaining the upper hand and proving itself to be superior in more and more areas, and more important to the rest of the world, more and more important to the rest of the world compared with the United States. And I think if you live in the developing world, that is much more obvious than it is if you live in the West. But how will it end? Well, I think that basically, I think what it requires is a shift in America's position. America has to accept that it can no longer enjoy a monopoly of being the hegemon, or if you like, a monopoly of primacy, which is what it is insisting on. It has to let go of that notion. And I think that will be the key to building a new relationship between the United States and China, which is very important for all of us in the world. And I think over time, that is what will happen, that the United States will come to recognize, probably does recognize implicitly in certain areas already, that it is not the leader in the way that it was before, but it just cannot let go of that geopolitical notion that it is the global hegemon. But it will be required to do, because it will no longer be strong enough. Imagine by 2030, the Chinese economy being, twice the size, or not 2035, twice the size of the American economy. I mean, that there's an inevitability about the fact that America will have to accept that it can no longer be the sole global hegemon. Okay, I shall stop now. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Martin, for that very thoughtful, erudite, and very carefully considered presentation of the issues regarding the disjuncture between US and China and its impact on the rest of the world. Thank you very much again. I will shortly be passing over to Johnson to conduct the question and answer. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank Andrew for introducing Martin. Andrew, I hope you will also be able to respond with your remarks after listening to Martin. And glad to inform that Boon, who introduced us to Martin, is also here with us. So perhaps, Johnson, before you conduct the question and answer, if Boon, if his internet is stable, perhaps he would like to say something before we open the floor to the rest of the audience. Boon, are you there? You'd like to say something before we take the questions?
Yes, I'm here, Kok Kyong. Just a few remarks following Martin's presentation. First of all, I would say, yes, it's not a new Cold War in the sense that it's very much unlike what the US-Soviet contest had been before. But at the same time, there's also this latent ideological divide between the US and China, not just what Biden and Trump had mentioned in terms of communist China. I mean, China has always been communist since 1949. But this kind of competition, which is getting more fierce, is at root, I think, based on the US ideology of a free market versus China's state-supported industry, which gives to the US mind an unfair edge in terms of competitiveness in global markets. So I think this is a kind of ideological difference which is at the root of the contest right now. And in that sense, it is more deeply ideological than the Cold War had been between the US and the Soviet Union, because the ideological divide at the time was, by comparison, not as deep as it is today. How this deeper division today develops, we are not sure. We'll have to wait and see. But also, I'd like to mention that, as Martin said, yes, this decoupling is not going to go very far, probably. I remember back in September last year, before even Biden was elected, Antony Blinken, as one of his advisors, said that Trump's decoupling cannot go very far, because it shouldn't go very far, because it can be very damaging. And we have seen Biden pick up on Trump's decoupling ethos and his approach, and we have not seen the limits of it yet. It's still going on. So we wonder how far it will go, because it is definitely damaging to the US economy. US companies investing in China, based in China, producing from there, are suffering. Whereas Chinese exports to the US have actually grown throughout last year, until December last year, and still growing probably this year as well, and the next. Whereas in the US, 30 industry sectors have complained to the Biden administration about tariffs on Chinese goods imported into the US. And now 7 of these industry sectors have taken the issue to the US industry court for a settlement. So things are not looking good for the US economy because of the decoupling. So this is a kind of a blowback, a mother of blowbacks, actually. So, I'll just stop there, and, maybe Johnson can continue. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Right. Now, there are quite a few questions and maybe 1 or 2 comments, and they pretty much go along the lines of your presentation, Dr. Jacques. Well, they cover war, governance and democracy, broadly speaking, economics, and there was 1 comment about the US stance towards China. Because there are so many questions, can I suggest that I read them out thematically? Perhaps you might want to take down the notes and then answer them en bloc. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll do my best.
All right. On war, Shazad Bhatti asks, I would be curious to learn whether there is a concern about military misadventures which might arise as a result of the contest between US and China. In particular, whether there should be a fear that there will be proxy wars outside the US and China which might impact other nations. That's one. Two, CT Chu. With so many Western warships arriving in the South China Sea, how do you rate the risk of a skirmish escalating into a hot war? Is there a hawkish cabal waiting for a hot war? Number three, Su Ming. How do you rate, currently the US seems to be ahead on the PR war against China. Do you see this shifting over time? If so, what is your opinion as to how it may be able to do so? Fourth, Jasmine, I agree that the IT will not replicate, or that it will not replicate the Cold War template, but I was wondering if it would shift to economic/technology war, i.e. the control of world rare earth material, which would be the next petrol if it is not already the most valuable raw material now. And lastly, on this theme, Dr. Chan Chi-wan has a two-part question. A, the tech war between China and US is escalating, covering many economical sectors. Far-reaching implications were seen in various social economic areas, including the military, affecting many countries. We have seen some negative outcomes of this tech war on the 5G telecommunication. It seems that the decoupling of tech products between the US and China is ongoing. Inflations could be caused by a higher production cost due to this tech war. What is your view? And B, what is your views on the possibility of a harmonized tech war between the US and China? That's it on war for now. Okay.
Do you want me to respond?
Yes, go ahead. And what I might do is share my screen so that in case you need to refer to this document.
Yeah, could you just
can you see my screen now?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. There you go.
The last question is the one I'm not so clear about.
Okay.
Let me just try. Oh, the tech war, yes, Dr. Chen. I'm just reading it now. Yeah, okay. You didn't ask any of the questions about governance and democracy, did you?
Not yet. I'll come to those after you've covered war.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think that the first two questions are sort of similar area. Is it likely that there'll be serious military skirmishes? Could that then degenerate into something much more serious, or what was described as a hot war and so on? Well, I think that we've got variable geometry on the military question, in that I do think that the United States and China view military power and military conflict in different ways, and attach very different importance to it. I think this point is really important to emphasize, actually. See, China's never really majored on military expansion. I mean, if you look at, sure, the expansion of China definitely had a fair number of wars, but they weren't the dominant feature of it. And if you look at the tributary system was not held together by force. The only time China really intervened, wrongly in my view, was in Vietnam in the in the 16th century. And China, if you think about it, China, I mean, you know, Britain and the United States, you know, military prowess is very important to their sense of identity. It's still true in my own country, even though we're now a pretty weedy power, certainly compared with the United States. But the United States has long, you know, I mean, from its birth, from fighting against the Native Americans and taking the land and so on, the United States attached enormous importance to military capability and military effectiveness. And China hasn't. And to this day, you know, I can't think, when did China last win a war? Well, when did it fight a really serious war? I don't count the Vietnam War. I do think the Vietnam War, border war in 1979 was a war, but I don't, you know, they went in and they went out in rather Confucian style. But otherwise, you know, you'd have to go back to the 17th century, really, and early 18th century to see when China last won something like that. It's had a history of so many defeats, and it's not really attached great importance to it. Contrast that with Japan, by the way, not just the United States, after the Meiji Restoration in the late 19th century. So there is variable geometry here. America regards military capability and the use of force as fundamental, and the Chinese don't. And you're going to see another very good illustration, I suspect, of this. Look at going into Afghanistan, and the Americans sent all their modern weaponry, as they did with Vietnam in an earlier era, and they failed. And what will China do? There's some speculation in the Western press that China will be the next country, be the next imperial power to get a bloody nose in Afghanistan. Oh no, they won't. There's not a month, in a month of Sundays, the Chinese are not going to have a military presence in Afghanistan. It's not the Chinese way, and quite frankly, the Chinese are not that stupid. What the Chinese will seek to do, whether successfully or not, is another matter. They'll seek to have an economic engagement with a Taliban government, which helps to rebuild the country. So this is a very, very different way of operating. Now, it doesn't answer the key question that were raised. Is, well, okay, you could still get, nonetheless, you know, some incident. I mean, the classic, the most obvious case at the moment is the South China Sea, where there could be an incident. But I think that I think it takes two to tango. You know, a war requires two sides, and or more, but in this case, two, let's say. And I think the Chinese, there's no way that China, in my view, will go to war over Taiwan. It's just not worth it. That doesn't mean they don't want reunification, and it doesn't mean they won't get it, but they won't get it by force. The cost to China, after all, it's on its doorstep. The cost to China, both in terms of itself and its trading relationships and its status in the world, would be enormous. So I don't think that the Chinese would want that or allow itself to get entangled in that kind of operation. So that brings us back to some kind of clash in the South China Sea. I wouldn't rule that out. I mean, you know, there have been, I mean, 2001, a US spy plane was intercepted by a Chinese fighter plane inside Chinese territory, Chinese economic zone, and the result of that was that the Chinese fighter got shot down and the pilot was killed. I don't think the spy plane suffered any human casualties. So, but that did not result in any kind of reciprocal action, subsequent reciprocal action from China of a military kind. But it certainly affected relations. And I think that we've got to expect, I mean, that's some time ago now, obviously 20 years ago, things have changed a lot. But I think China will seek to avoid something like that. Now, so what game does China play militarily? Well, you know, one thing the Chinese find humiliating, if you like, in the manner of the century of humiliation, is the fact that there are many forays along that along the southern coastline of China by American spy planes and American I can't remember the figures now. I think it's 2 a day. But when I was reading a book the other day, I think it was 2 a day. So that's 700 and over 700 a year. And that's you know, on your border. I mean, imagine Chinese planes flying up and down Florida, just off the coast of Florida. I mean, it would be the same thing. So they resent it. So and they regard it quite rightly as a threat to their sovereignty. So the Chinese have built up a military capability with their new weapons, missiles, to be able to make life increasingly to make American aircraft carriers in the South China Sea increasingly vulnerable to attack if that should happen, and that's a deterrent effect, if you like. Now, one way or another, I'm not ruling out at all that there could be some military exchanges, but I think the idea that it will degenerate into a really serious hot war is probably, well, let's not say it's impossible, but let's say it's very unlikely, is how I would sum it up. In terms of proxy wars, I mean, China doesn't really have, I mean, what I'm trying to think, maybe I'm short of imagination here, or even factual grasp, but I'm trying to think who China's proxies would be, because China doesn't really operate like that. It doesn't have proxies in the way that America did in the Cold War, and certainly the Soviet Union did in the Cold War. I mean, it's not used, you know, national liberation forces, for example, as proxies in a way that the Soviet Union tended to, but China hasn't really done that. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm happy to be corrected on that point. Now, on the PR point, yeah, I agree with you that Americans are better than the Chinese at this. The Chinese are ham-fisted. Now, how do we account for this? I think that it's about different political systems, and the Chinese political system is obviously very different from the US political system and the sort of tradition of Western democracies. And China is not very familiar at handling that kind of thing. I think one of the reasons why it didn't handle Hong Kong well was because, in key respects, was because China doesn't really understand that kind of political culture and how it operates. And the reason is it's quite simple, because it's so different. By the way, it's also true that the Western media is not effective within China, because I think the West doesn't understand China. So this is a question of, you know, the big political and cultural differences are such that both the West and China find it difficult to operate in the other's terrain with real effect. Now, the question, I think, the interesting question then is, could it change? You know, I mean, I think China, I mean, I thought during the pandemic, the worst of the pandemic, when China was really feeling very, very angry about the way it was being attacked by the West and by the United States, quite rightly, by the way, in my view. I mean, there it was fighting the pandemic on its own, and all America and my country as well, you know, political parties, there was a consensus to you know, excuse the expression, pour shit all over China, demonize it. You know, it was shocking in my view, absolutely shocking. No expression of compassion whatsoever. And so I understand that China felt under assault during that period, but it didn't handle itself very well, given that. I mean, I understand that, but there was too much tit for tat. There was too much, you know. I think China has to develop a kind of PR approach, which is much more, you know, I think it has to think like, this is what I tell the Chinese anyway, that what you've got to walk tall. You're a great country. You know, you're a big country. You should act, you know, you should act big. You should walk tall. You shouldn't anyway get in the gutter with Trump. You know, Trump lives in the gutter. That's what he is. That's the kind of person and politician, and that's his philosophy. China shouldn't do that. China's got to, you know, China's got to think long term. I mean, who's the audience for China? The audience for China is the world. Why? Because China is becoming already the most important country in the world. Therefore, it has to be able to communicate in a way which everyone, wherever they are, can understand. And this will become more and more important to China, not less and less important. So it has to think hard about how it deals with it. And I think at the moment, it's sometimes it just, you know, I'm not, it needs to be, there's something else I think which is appreciated in Western culture, but isn't really part of the way China operates. And that is to be self-critical. And the Chinese are not very good at being self-critical in a way which sounds convincing. Internally, they're very self-critical. How the hell do they keep, you know, reforming and reinventing themselves? Because they're extremely self-critical in a way that Western countries are not self-critical at all. But when it comes to sort of verbal exchange and these kind of diplomatic battles and media battles and so on, you know, China doesn't come across like that. So I think there's a lot of learning to do. Now, you've got to remember that China's emergence on the world stage is extremely recent phenomenon. I mean, if we go back to 2000, China was not a player on the world stage. You know, it's a very recent, I would say, basically it starts around 2008, you know, the Olympics and so on. That's when it became, you know, China, people began to think about China a different way. Hey, you know, China's going to be really important. China's going to be a serious player in the world and so on. And so all of this is new to China. There's a generation in Beijing and so on, the government and so on, which have got very little experience of the West. And they're very, I mean, the Chinese are very, very conscientious. I mean, they really, you know, they mug up, they prepare carefully, they're very, very diligent, and they're very professional. But, you know, how do you make up for the fact that you've been absent from the world for, you know, the modern world? They've always been absent from the modern world. It was only after Deng Xiaoping really, that they started entering the world. And so they've got enormous sort of cultural and PR deficit, if you like, which they have to learn. So I think that, I think I've gone into some detail of this, but I think it's a really interesting question. And I think China will get much better at it. But they've got, you know, I mean, CGTN, which I'm sure all of you at some point or other watch, I mean, do have some really good programs, excellent programs, but some of it is a bit wooden. And the problem with a lot of the Chinese presentation is it's a bit too wooden. It's not really for people who, you know, it's written for people who are on side too much, not people who start with a deep doubt and skepticism about China. And those are the people that need to be shifted, because at the moment in the West, we've gone backwards. The attitudes toward China become much more negative and so on. So, you know, the ground that China has to learn how to deal with is when you've got a lot of negativity. Right. Now, on the tech war and so on, I agree with your points about the nature of this. I mean, I'll give you, Yang Shutong, who I know well, who's professor of international relations at Tsinghua University, is very, very good. He wrote an article recently saying that really the absolute there are two arbiters of the future in his view in this contest with the United States. One is leadership, which I partly agree with and partly don't go the whole way with him on, because I think governance is a wider question. But anyway, never mind. Doesn't matter about that. We're talking about tech. And the other is the tech war. And he thinks that the critical battleground is going to be digital technology. It's an interesting article. For those who are interested, it's in something called the Chinese Journal of International Politics. And his argument is that this is going to be absolutely critical. Whoever wins this will shape this century. And so I think that you're right to say this is really important, and it's a moving feast, isn't it? I mean, we don't know which way it's going to go. I mean, it's interesting to compare, I think, Trump's trade war with Trump's tech war. I mean, the trade war was ill thought out. It had no kind of strategy, no phases built into the approach. It was a blunderbuss approach. It was completely ill-conceived, and it dealt very little. It did very little harm to China. In fact, China clearly was the winner from the trade war. The tech war was something quite different, I think. I think the tech war was much better thought out and much more effective, and damaged the Chinese tech sector much more. The classic example being the damage suffered by Huawei, which was real damage in the sense that, you know, Huawei's two key areas, which is telecom equipment and mobile phones, both of those sectors of Huawei have been, you know, seriously damaged. Profits fell last year by 29%. The one thing that won't happen though is that, you know, you can bet your bottom renminbi, not bottom dollars, that Huawei will survive, because Huawei, if anyone has followed its history, is a remarkable firm, and it will reinvent itself. It's a very smart firm, and the big boss is a very clever man. So I think it will survive. But you know, you're right. This is going to be a critical area to watch. One thing I didn't mention, by the way, which I meant to mention, I did have it in my notes, was just, you know, 5G as an illustration of the weakness of America's alliances. Because in Europe, I mean, it's true that by and large, probably the effect of Trump's demand that European countries don't use Huawei for 5G, it did affect probably the extent to which they used it. But, you know, I think I'm right in saying only 3 countries in Europe are not using the Huawei. Britain has been heavily involved with Huawei and is pulling out. But then Britain is, you know, I'm sorry to say this, but is a lapdog in the United States, you know, and it can't reinvent itself. But it seemed as if it was doing so around 2014, 15 with the previous Conservative administration of Osborne and Cameron. The other country was Romania, and there's another one I read the other day. I think Sweden has finally decided that it's not going to use Huawei. So that would be 2 countries, Romania and Sweden, and the UK is pulling out by 2027. Otherwise, everyone is using, all European countries in some degree or other are using Huawei. So there's an illustration about, you know, you can't draw the line. The lines will not be drawn in the simple way of the Cold War. Oh yes, and then the other thing about I don't know how to answer the question about rare earth minerals. I'm not sure how important that is going to be. I mean, certainly hitherto in history, these kind of, you know, control of resources has been really important. I mean, you've only got to think of oil and American involvement in the Middle East, and before that, Britain and France, to see how important that has been geopolitically. I'm not sure whether that is going to be true. That is going to be so true in the future. I mean, Yang Zhutong, his article says he definitely doesn't think it's going to be so important. I'll reserve my view about that until let's see what happens. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. A lot of questions there. Okay, I see a raised hand just as well. Unfortunately, I can't remember the name and all I see are a bunch of numbers. So, well, the floor is yours. You need to unmute first.
Hi. Can I ask a
So
question of?
1 second, Mr. Shen. There's, yeah.
My name is Albert Chok. I'd like to ask a question of Professor Martin. With the rise of China, how do you see the continuing future of the US dollar as the international currency?
Very good question. Well, this is now, it looks as if it's entering a new phase, this question. I mean, it's clear that the American economy is no longer big enough to sustain the dollar as a reserve currency. But that doesn't mean that it will end, because there has not until now been a possible rival to it. There are two candidates. One is the euro, but the euro's never, I mean, the euro's position has been relatively static as in terms of the holdings of central banks in the euro. And the other is the renminbi. And the obvious candidate is the renminbi. Indeed, Ray Dalio, who's the man behind Bridgewater, which is America's biggest hedge fund, who's very interested in China. He argues that China is bound to become a hugely important financial center, and the renminbi is going to become very important. And I think that that probably what's happening, but I don't know enough about it really. I know I do read about it, but I haven't really made up my mind too clearly about it. Is that the new challenge, the new kid on the block is digital currencies, and as in so many areas, you know, China's very foresighted. I mean, China's been moving on this for a long time, well ahead of the United States, it could be that the development of digital currencies, especially digital renminbi, which is already happening, it's already in the early stages, and it will be used as currency at the Winter Olympics early next year in China, and so they've already taking it into a sort of test phase. The problem that China's got has been that because of the way it's developed, it's not I mean, it's got strong capital controls, and it's quite rightly so. One thing China learned from the financial crisis, the Asian financial crisis, was don't abandon your capital controls. It wasn't long before, at the time, Mahathir said we're going to use capital controls, quite rightly so. And China's, there's no way that China's going to make itself prey to, movements in financial markets which undermine its own economy. So that's why it's been very strict, that its its ability to control its situation, or if you like, its economy, or if you like, its commitment to its own sovereignty in the fullness of the term, overweighs the temptation of going for it with the renminbi as a reserve currency. So the days of the dollar are numbered, but I don't know what the number is. You know, it's very difficult to give an answer to this. I mean, it will be a very, very important moment, because if you look at the way, especially under Trump, because Trump accentuated it, the Americans use financial warfare against other countries, you know, left, right, and center, you know, by excluding them for the dollar system. Cuba, I mean, look at poor old Cuba. You know, I mean, it's been excluded from the international financial system. So it's dependent on the largesse, to some degree, of the Soviet Union as it was, and also, you know, to a lesser extent, I suppose, China today, because you know, because America throttles it economically and financially. Iran is a similar casualty. Russia is, of course, also under this pressure. So yeah, it makes me angry when I read in Western press, like the Financial Times, about, you know, well, China's economic coercion. Excuse me, the United States has been hugely a huge user of economic coercion against countries all around the world. I mean, what was the threat to take punitive action against Europe over 5G other than economic coercion? So, so it will be a very important moment when it will be a very, very important political and economic moment when the United States loses its reserve, its status as of basically the sole provider of a reserve currency. I would be okay. Let me look. It's got to happen within the next 20 years. I can't see it not happening in 20 years. 20 years would take us to 2040, by which time the Chinese economy would be so much bigger than the American economy, so much more important to the global economy, so much more important to virtually every economy around the world, apart from those in America's vicinity, like Canada and Mexico. Then at that point, by then, it seems to me, China will inevitably have a reserve currency. Well, we don't even know exactly what the currency system would look like in that period, but it would be the end of the dollar system as we have known it. Now, 20 years is a long time, I think, in this, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's not earlier.
Can I venture 2 comments to what you just said, Professor?
Yeah.
I would like to say that basically what underpins the acceptance of a currency as an international reserve is basically confidence. So it's whether someone or a country would like to hold your currency. So confidence depends on the economic and the social standing, or perhaps the military standing of that country. You look at the history of international reserve, sterling went down because the British Empire came down, and the Spanish dollar came down because the Spanish Empire came down. So then the other thing that is not very helpful to the US dollar is it's basically a petrodollar. It's underpinned by oil. And with the climate change and the process of walking away from oil towards other things, then I think without oil to underpin, and in a way, Saudi Arabia has been the one, and all the wars in the Middle East has been fought to basically sustain the US dollar. But with oil and the Middle East going the opposite direction, I agree with you that the days are numbered for the US dollar, but nobody know when that would be. But with the Belt and Road, as more and more countries are willing to accept renminbi as the currency for them to hold, both in terms of accepting the investment, the inward transmission of real goods and services in return for holding a liability in renminbi. China don't have very much choice. It's basically selling your goods in exchange for holding renminbi. So basically, that's how they. It's nothing to do with digital because the technical structure of money doesn't really matter. It's at the end of the day, money is a business of confidence. It's just who will trust your check. That's all. That's my view, Professor.
Okay, thank
Yeah,
you, Albert.
that?
Sure, Martin.
Yeah, I think those are very good points, which I agree with. Confidence, but you know, confidence is the problem is the American economy is getting weaker and weaker, less and less. What is it? Percentage share of the global economy now, I think, is down to 14 or 15%. I mean, it's less than that of China, and so it's not really got the economic strength to support a reserve currency anymore. Now, confidence, I mean, also, but China's still, I think, too much of an unknown quantity. Now, I'll give you a very good example. You know, China's just, you know, as you know, has been introducing very tough new regulatory requirements of the tech firms, like Alibaba and Didi and Tencent and so on. And this has really shaken the share prices of these companies at a time when a lot of Western money, more than ever before, is being invested. It's still way below what it should be, but it's going into China. So I think that the confidence question is also about comprehension, you know, about understanding. And one of the difficulties that China, you know, China, there's a huge legacy of ignorance about China, and of course deep skepticism and negativity as well. All of those things are in play, and they affect the confidence people have in China. And I think that, I mean, one of the things I think in the short to long term China will need to do is to find ways of becoming more transparent generally, so that it explains what it's doing. So people can sort of calibrate it, can find a way of being able to have some register with regard to what's happening and where it's going and so on. But at the moment, China doesn't bother to do that, really. At the moment, it's not interested in it, beyond the point. And the reason for that is because it knows and feels that and believes that what matters is the Chinese economy. And so, you know, everything else is of secondary importance. Anyway, thanks for those remarks.
Okay, so I was going to call on Tan Sri Andrew Sheng, but I think I'll leave him to a bit later because Mr. Ken Shen has been waiting to ask a question. Then we'll come to Andrew after the next block of questions. Great. Yes, Ken, please go ahead.
Professor, thank you for sharing your time, your thoughts, and your insights. Question I have for you is, you know, as the economy, income, standard of living in China have grown, natural thing, as we've seen from many countries in the region and of course around the world throughout the history of mankind, even though democracy and personal freedoms are not necessarily so well entrenched in the Asian culture, you know, nevertheless, over time, you're going to see in China an increasing demand for personal freedoms. By the same token, particularly in this current regime, we're seeing tightening, ruthless tightening of grip on controls, you know, whether it's related to Hong Kong, Xinjiang. How do you see over time these competing and actually, you know, obviously very conflicting needs and demands getting reconciled when the rubber hits the road? Is it, you know, a Tiananmen times 50, exponentially 50 times type of explosion, or is there any way potentially it's going to be peacefully resolved? Because actually, you know, and this goes back to one of the things you said, that the most important thing is the economy. I actually think that the most important thing for the government and the party, and from which everything flows from it, is the survival of the party. And the economy is tied to the survival of the party, but at the end of the day, the most important thing for the powers that be there is the survival of the party, I believe. So how do you see all this reconciling and playing out, Professor? Thank you.
I think the point you make about China is also true of every country, actually, that self-preservation of the governing system is fundamental. The way in which political leaderships and governing elites regard the future of their country and the future of themselves. And I don't think that's particularly distinctive to China. I mean, the thing about I would say that I think the Chinese political system, and I think my position has probably shifted since I wrote When China Rules the World on this. I think that the Chinese Communist Party has been a remarkably gifted and able in the way it's been able to lead China, and I think we have to reflect on, there's so much sort of Cold Warish type, attitudes, say the word communist and it's toxic. So I mean, Pompeo knew what he was doing when he reduced China to the Chinese Communist Party, because you don't need to think about anything else then, because baby, you've got it. It's just all about the Chinese Communist Party. Of course, this is nonsense. So I think that they have, I mean, I think that it is an interesting point. I think all Chinese leaderships down the ages have suffered from paranoia. And the reason for the paranoia is this is a huge country, and you can never really know so large exactly what's happening in the country. So they've lived in fear of the unknown, of what might happen, and so I think that has been a strength actually of this present regime, which is they're the opposite to complacent. They understand, the Chinese have this expression in their governing philosophy is serve the people, and we don't. In the West, you probably think, well, just words. No, they're not words. They know that, and the emperors knew that unless the people were okay and on side and were reasonably happy, then we'd move on to the next dynasty eventually. And so I think that, I think this is it's very powerful in a country like China because it's so big. It's so difficult to hold together. It's so difficult to govern. I mean, we're talking about a continent, running a continent, 1.4 billion people. We're not talking about running the UK with 70 or Malaysia 30 million or the US with 300 million. That's a completely different kettle of fish altogether. So I think that my conclusion from this is, one, that China's had an extraordinarily effective governing system to deal with this phase of its history, and the Chinese Communist Party has achieved. It is hugely the most successful political party in the world. I mean, I can't think of anything else that has been as effective, certainly in global terms, over the last century, as the Chinese Communist Party. Well, okay, since 1949, 49 to 78, not so effective in key respects. Since 78, masterclass, really, a masterclass in how to lead a country of such size and complexity. Now, the problem is that you're right to say that there are all kinds of disparate interests. Look, the sheer pace of change, I think we've got to think of it like this. China was growing for 35 years at 10% a year. That means living standards were double. That means the economy was doubling in size every 7 years. And living standards were increasing more or less in proportion. So they were increasing around about 10%. Now the growth rate's now down to 6, 7%, something like that. So it's only happening now, doubling every 10 years. But those changes in people's lives are incredible. Imagine your living standards doubling every 10 years. Well, the West knows nothing like it. Malaysia's got some familiarity with it because you still carried on growing at around 4 or 5%, but here, you know, you've got 2% if you're lucky, and that's it. And so in those situations, people's lives are so a process of dynamic change all the time. So what will it be? What are the now in a situation like that? I think that the only way a governing elite, a governing class, a Communist Party can operate is by constantly trying to anticipate, you know, to give leadership to itself and the country by anticipating those kind of changes and the kind of problems and questions that are being raised by them. I mean, I noticed that there's some I think the question of how they're handling the tech firms at the moment, and also the question of how they're handling the private schools and the private tutoring classes is very interesting. Now, the Western criticism of it, oh, you know, just the state throwing its weight around. Oh, come on, let's be serious about this. There are obviously social tensions that are involved in this. They are worried, you know, one of the things that China has to be wary of more and more is social inequality. China's been very unequal for a long time, but it's basically been regional inequality. It's been regional inequality between Guangdong and southern China and the Beijing area, Beijing, Tianjin, and the Yangtze Delta. They've been very prosperous, but the central China and western China even more have been very poor. They couldn't really do much about that because Deng Xiaoping's strategy depended on getting some money from somewhere. So he started in the south. He couldn't start everywhere because they didn't have any money. So they had to make some money somehow. Now, now I think what you're going to get more and more is urban inequalities becoming a bigger factor in people's lives. So I think probably part of what they're doing now is addressing some of these urban tensions. And by the way, what's interesting about the attack on the tech firms is America should have been tackling these problems much earlier. They had these big tech firms earlier, but they've rampaged across the economy and people's rights and individual rights and privacy and all these kind of things to a far greater extent that's happening in China. It's a relatively new phenomenon in China, about 6 or 7 years old. So anyway, I hope I'm not going too off subject, sir.
No, but you know, one thing, and then I don't want to take up too much of your time, sir. But you know, one thing that's very telling, and I think you'd be challenged to find a similar type of statistic in the U.S. anytime in recent history. I had read, it was in Bloomberg some time ago, but the survey was of Chinese who had, it was something like about $100,000 equivalent or more of assets. And the question was posed to these people. And the response that came back from something like 70% of these people, that they had near-term plans to get their family, their business, and their capital out of the country. Something like 70%. And then that obviously tells you a little bit of corollary to my earlier question, you know, what are these people who obviously, you know, now that they've got their higher standard of living, you know, higher income, now they start thinking about, oh, well, you know, I want some personal liberties. And this tells you sort of what is the confidence that they have in their business, in, you know, have their kids, their families grow up, and the future of the country. And that is a stark and quite a sobering statistic. I don't know if you have seen anything similar to that, Professor. That's a statistic I mentioned to you.
Well, I think...
Okay, Prof, just to point out, it's already 9:45 here. So perhaps you keep this brief because there's more questions and there's an interesting block of questions on governance that's quite relevant to what you were talking about earlier. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, you know, I think that I don't think the evidence is that firstly, beyond the point, I don't believe this. I don't believe, because the reason is because if you want to make money, and these kind of guys you're talking about want to make money, where better to make it than in China? I mean, you know, where are you going to go? America? I'm sorry, you know, you're going to be much better off in China making money. So I don't believe that they all want to leave China, because China is not only their home, but it's the place where they've been very, very successful, and they will continue to be very, very successful. China is on the verge now of becoming, or no, already just become, I think, the largest retail market in the world. So I don't think that, I don't believe this. And, you know, the fact of the matter is, look, I'll give you another statistic. You look at Chinese students, the early phases of Chinese students who were studying in America, UK, etc., they were about 2/3, I think. I can't remember the exact figures, but something like 2/3, maybe 3/4, never went back to China. Now the figures are about 90% returning back to China. Why do they go back to China? Why don't they stay in the United States? Because the opportunities in China are now much better than they are in the United States.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Ken. Right, so now for the, well, there is a hand raised, but I'll come back to you, Wai Leong, and I will round back to Tan Sri Andrew as well, because it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on the currency and the financial topic just now. But there's now a block of governance and democracy, Prof. So from Man Kong, and you just touched on this slightly just now, he says, I understand you have spent some time in China. What are your views of the government, the people, and the university students you have lectured? And second part of his question is, what are your views of Chinese government's recent promotion of building a world/humanity of common values/goals? Next question, JC Lim. Why is the US so obsessed that their form of democracy is the only form of government for the world and no others, just like either my way or no way? And then there's Shazad Bhati. When you say Chinese governance has been extremely effective, can you also speak to the deeply problematic genocide of the Uyghurs as a consequence of that same governance? And the next two questions are somewhat related. First one, Setsuya Sato, talking about effective governance in China, what is your view on the Chinese authorities' confidence to deal with shrinking and aging population? It appears the newly introduced three-child policy is not working. And then from Asman, one question on demographics. Will China get rich and really developed, i.e. holistically, including handling increasing demands for freedoms before it gets old? So that's the block of questions on governance and democracy.
Yeah, okay. What's my opinion of the people I've met? Well, of the students I've met, I mean, I think Chinese students are very impressive. They're extremely hardworking. They're very, in that sense, they're very, very good students. Sure, not all of them, but generally, I think that is the case. I mean, I've not only met a lot, but I've also taught a lot. And they've got this huge thirst, actually, to acquire knowledge. You know, the good student is the hungry student, and they are very hungry students. Well, I know a lot of Chinese, or have met a lot of Chinese scholars, and you know, they're like every country, they're uneven, but by and large, I think that the stereotype that operates in the West, which is, you know, they all parrot the same line, is, well, I just never found that. But the first time I went to China seriously, which was 2005, I was immediately catapulted into some very, very interesting debates and arguments about Chinese foreign policy, Chinese economy. I mean, you know, this is, if you think about China's changes and dynamism, this is really exactly what you'd expect. You wouldn't expect a kind of monolithic top-down view to be certainly amongst these kind of people, and they're not. One of the tragedies of Western reporting, actually, of China is utter failure to interview leading scholars in China. I mean, it's extraordinary. They just, you know, they'd rather interview someone in America, maybe of Chinese extraction, rather than or a Western expert on China, rather than talking to the Chinese in China. And they're making a huge mistake, because they're much better. Basically, they're much better, and much more interesting. And what you think are the key questions from outside can be very different when you're in China. The questions that they are asking, and which they are debating. So if you want to be up with the game, you need to. Those are the kind of people you need to be speaking to, not the people who are miles away, you know, thousands of miles away. The other thing I would say, you know, is just the level of competence. You know, I think that Chinese statecraft is basically the best in the world, and you know, they know how to run a society. They know how to organize. They know what the difference is between strategic thinking and tactical thinking. So they think very long term, and they think in a very pragmatic way as well when required. They're very impressive. And the tragedy in the West is, you know, since neoliberalism and so on, is the running down of government bureaucracies and the deterioration in the standards and the level of a lot of government. So there's a lot of government. In the West, there's been lots of governance and a loss of public interest and the ability to intervene. So I think basically I'd have to say, you know, not everyone, of course, we're talking about a very large number of people, but basically, you know, a very positive and impressive view of Chinese. On the common values, I think that you know, I think that the deep in the Chinese historical and therefore contemporary mind, because no country is as aware of its history than it's China, is that the Chinese way of thinking starts with the world. It doesn't start with the nation state. This is a great difference between Chinese way of thinking and the Western way of thinking. And the reasons for this go way back to Chinese civilization. Chinese civilization, obviously, very long time ago, 2,000 years, let's say 2,000 years, or before 2,000, 2,500 years, Confucius, there were no borders. And China's very interesting. We're going to come to Xinjiang in a minute, but China didn't really, in the imperial period, make distinctions between different ethnicities, or not sharp distinctions between different ethnicities. China is a very ethnically mixed society, but has a very strong sense of identity amongst those who regard themselves as Han. But of course, they're not really Han at all, because they come from many different races. Now, China's notion, the emperor, you know, the emperor's notion of the world, of China, was Tianxia, all under heaven. And this comes before the unification of China. It comes from the Zhou period, Zhou dynasty, really. And so their starting point was a notion, a concept of the world, or everyone under heaven. And so it wasn't, under heaven was everyone, not this ethnic group or this racial group or this gender, what have you. So the Chinese have, in their way of thinking, and Tianxia I mean, there's a big debate now about Tianjia and what it means, all under heaven, and in China amongst the scholars and intellectuals and so on, and which is beginning to spread outside China significantly as well. And that has, the starting point is the world. So I think this whole idea of common destiny, common future for mankind, I think it is quite natural to the way the Chinese think, whereas it is completely unnatural for the West, because the West's modern history has been the history of the nation state. So the thinking in the West starts with the nation state, and it doesn't, and therefore what the world is an agglomeration of nation states, as opposed to a world which you start with a world outlook and a sense of what the commonalities and so on are. And I think this is a way into Chinese thinking about its relationship with the world. And I think it's going to become, we need to know about this. We need to try and understand it, because it's going to be very influential, because China is going to be much more influential than it is now. Why are the Americans obsessed with? Well, I think that you've got to go back to the creation of the United States, really. You know, the creation of the United States was, you know, European settlers went to America and wanted to create a new world, a new society. So they effectively exterminated by war or disease the native population. And the creation of America was this restless move from the East Coast to the West Coast, and then across the Pacific to Hawaii, and then, of course, by the late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, the colonization of the Philippines and so on. And so America's always had this sense of manifest destiny. It's got this missionary zeal. I mean, you know, the American Constitution is everyone should be like America. This is the model for everyone. And so it's a sort of evangelical mentality, which is probably has been strong as anything during the period between 1945 until Trump, because Trump in some ways took America back in history to a more kind of nationalist position. So I think that's why America, it's so strong with America, and it's been reinforced by various developments. I mean, America's relationship with religion is very different from that in Europe, for example. You know, fundamentalism is very important influence, especially on the Republican Party. In fact, probably it's one of the dominant influences on the Republican Party and the way that Americans think. So anyway, that's the way I would try and answer that question, is to look at it, you know, not just in a contemporary sense, but over a long history. You know, America's job is messianic, is to convert the world to its way of thinking, just like it, as it were, converted America by a process of destruction and construction in its modern idiom. Now, on the Uyghur, look, I've been to Urumqi. I haven't been to other cities in Xinjiang, and I think that China's had a problem with two regions in particular since 1949. One is Tibet, and the other is Xinjiang. Now, the Tibetans, I can't remember exactly how many they're old, 6 million, 9 million, something like that. The Uyghur are about 10 million. Xinjiang's population is 20 million, so about roughly half the population. But both of these groups have never really, you know, are outsiders in China, in the sense they're way over in the Western region of China. And they've never, whereas the rest of China in some degree or other has been integrated in all sorts of ways, even though there are many different racial groups involved, even though there are more Muslims in the rest of China than there are, a lot more than there are in Xinjiang. But they are all part of a sort of modern idiom, if you like, a modern China, a modern way of living. And they've been in some degree or other sinicide. And I think that that just hasn't happened in the same way in Tibet and in Xinjiang for the Uyghur. Now, another problem in Xinjiang is that there is a serious terrorist problem. I don't know why it's never talked about, but you know, it's always talked about ad nauseam. No, I was going to say ad nauseam, perhaps that's the wrong phrase, but so much in the West. But it's not talked about. It's talked about in Afghanistan, vis-a-vis Afghanistan, but the West doesn't talk about it in the context of Xinjiang. But it's a really serious problem. I mean, when I was writing my book, I think it was in I can't remember. It's either I think maybe 2008. There was a big, you know, a pogrom on the scale of what happened in Malaysia in 1969, and so when I was in Urumqi, I you know, it's a very modern glass and steel city and so on, typical modern Chinese city. But there's one thing that's different, and that is you don't see any, quite frankly, you never see any police in China. But in Urumqi, you know, I did, and as I was walking around Urumqi, you go around a corner and there would be a, you know, like you know, sort of semi-military vehicle, but armed police kind of thing, and this was quite regular, and that was clearly about a serious terrorist problem in Urumqi, and it reminded me actually of my visits to Belfast during the 1970s in the Troubles, where that was what you saw in Belfast, I mean, and Londonderry and so on, and it was a very fierce, strong reminder. Now, the difficult, you know, the Chinese public relations handling of their approach to Xinjiang has been absolutely dreadful, in my opinion. They didn't explain anything. They've only recently really tried to start saying what they're trying to do. What do I think is happening in Xinjiang? Look, in some ways I'm as ignorant as you are about this, except for the things I've been talking about. Those aren't ignorant. That's based on knowledge. But exactly what I haven't been to Urumqi now. It's about 2014, 15, something like that. I don't believe the stories about genocide at all. I do not believe that is true. I think that is not, you know, I think that is I mean, you've got to remember there's a huge Cold War operation being organized in the United States. And the Uyghur, what's it called? The World Uyghur Congress is based in Washington and New York, and is funded seriously by American money. And so you've got to be able, you know, this is a difficult question to decide what's going on. And I was talking to a friend of mine who's Chinese, who worked for a little bit as my assistant in London when he was a student, and he now works for China Daily. And he was sent for 3 weeks with a group from China Daily to look into, you know, to report on Xinjiang. But he said, look, and he actually comes from around Xinjiang, but he's not Uyghur, he's Han. And he said to me that, you know, it's very difficult. I said, what about these big buildings? You know, so, you know, they're called internment. I don't believe this stuff, internment camps. And the Chinese say, no, this is to try and modernize, you know, give them the skills and language skills and, you know, working skills that enable them to be more successful. And he said, look, I found it very difficult to find out what the situation was. So I think this is a very complicated question. By the way, just one other point. So I'm just trying to explain background, because I'm not going to give you a position on it, because all I say is that I think that some of the stories are rubbish, and the genocide story is rubbish. But what is actually happening on the ground, I can't enlighten you. The only other thing I want to say is that one of the big problems in Xinjiang, I mean, this is a huge province. It's 1/6 of the landmass of China, with extremely small population, because it consists of mountains and deserts and so on. So it's inhospitable, a lot of it, to human inhabitation. And basically, the Han move to these places, like they move to Tibet and other parts of China. They are urban people. They go to the cities, whereas the Uyghur are essentially pastoral people who, until quite recently, were semi-nomadic. So the difference in their conditions, the difference in their circumstances, is enormous. Now, of course, there are plenty of Uyghurs in cities like Urumqi and Kashgar, but nonetheless, that is the sort of separation you have. In Urumqi, there are a huge number of mosques. When I was there, huge number of mosques. I can't imagine they've all gone, because they're beautiful buildings actually, and they're pretty modern buildings as well. I mean, they're built in the old style, but they're pretty modern, recently built. So I think that China has handled the public relations side of this very poorly. I don't believe a lot of the propaganda, but I do think there's a problem. And the problem is that there's a resentment on the part of the Uyghur towards the Han. I mean, the pogrom I talked about was basically a Uyghur pogrom against the Han I think it was in Urumqi in 2009. So, yeah, so these are very complicated questions, and but that's all I can say about it for now. The shrinking population in China. Well, the first mistake they made was they should have lifted the one-child policy much earlier, but they didn't. The second problem stroke indicator is that if you look across East Asia at countries which travel this route earlier than China, like South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, very, very low birth rates in these countries. Hong Kong, 1.1, something like that, very low, 1.2. So this was going to happen, and I think they just didn't. They should have moved earlier. You're right that lifting the one-child policy had a bit of an effect, positive effect, in the first year, but I think in the second year, the birth rate went down. So they're now, as you say, introducing a three-child policy, but that's not the only thing. They're introducing a whole raft of reforms in terms of childcare, costs of childcare, and so on. And these are the things they have to address, because the difficulty is China's a very, very competitive society, and women now in China, who for a long time were, oppressed. One of the fantastic things about China now is just the huge number of young women, professional young women, who are rising up the career ladders in their various different fields. And with opportunities like that, just as has happened in the West, then countries like Italy and so on, and Ireland, very strongly, all Catholic countries that had lots of kids. They don't want to, they want to have a career. They don't want to just make babies or have babies. So they have to tackle the problem from the angle of these young women and what they and their time and their and their costs. And it's very expensive in China, in the big cities, to raise a child. And because it's getting more and more successful, it becomes more and more competitive. So the Chinese have got to approach the question, it seems to me, like, you know, what are the needs of young women? Because at the end of the day, that'll be a decisive question as to how many babies they're prepared to have. How successful they'll be, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, none of these other countries have been that successful. You know, the population, the birth rate has remained low. So my expectation is that China is going to have a hard time on this. But maybe they'll come up with some really good ideas. They're very creative. They can be very creative. So we'll have to see. And they really believe in intervening. I mean, they believe in intervening in a way we don't in the West, to try and solve problems, social problems. So as you can see now, the issues I raised earlier.
Right, great. Okay, I'm afraid we've got to wrap up very soon. So I would like to invite Tan Sri Andrew Sheng to say a few words, make his comments. Well, either. Oh, okay. Prof. Martin. Yeah.
Will you give me 30 seconds? I'm not going to the toilet, but someone's leaving, and I've got to give them something.
Okay. So yes, opportune time, Tan Sri. Perhaps you'd like to make some comments about either the currency or anything we've discussed so far.
I think the currency issue is quite clear. You know, you can't keep on printing money like what the Fed is doing without consequences. And at the same time, as Martin said quite correctly, if you start weaponizing the dollar, those who get affected will be reluctant to use the dollar. And that essentially is why there's the rise of the cyber currencies. And I think Martin is spot on these issues. I'm very conscious of the time, so I think I would cede to anyone else who has some urgent questions to ask.
Okay, thank you, Tan Sri. Wai Leong, would you still like to ask your question or make your comment? If you would like to do so, please turn on your video and unmute yourself.
Yes, hello, yes, if Professor will indulge me. Has he come back already?
Yes, he is here. Yeah.
Oh, hi.
You've muted yourself, Wai Leong. Please unmute. Yeah.
Professor,
okay.
Yeah, thank you for spending time with us. This is a question with a bit of self-interest with children growing up and looking at tertiary education. I would think or assume that China's success must be attributable to its educational reform or its advancement or its openness to change. You have been in academia teaching there. Would you now encourage parents, especially from Southeast Asia, from Malaysia, to actually look into China as a priority compared to the traditional view of sending children to the Western institutions? Thank you.
This is a good question. Yes, I would definitely encourage. In fact, I don't know whether she's still present, but one of the people that I requested be invited to this is a Malaysian who studied at Fudan University for a couple of years, and is now working for the Malaysian government in terms of Chinese investment and so on. And I think that she had I think I'm right in saying she had a very positive experience of studying at Fudan University, yeah, but really positive. And I think she found the teaching very good, and the kind of subject she was studying very good, and so on. So I think that I think it's more important. When it's very interesting you know, when I first met my wife, it was 1993 actually on Tierman, and all her friends, you know, in those days, that they would be, she was in her mid-20s then, and all her friends, they had very little experience of traveling in East Asia. Their lines of communication, their lines of travel would be westwards to the UK or the US, and to a lesser extent Europe, but not to other countries in the region. Well, obviously Singapore maybe, because it's so close, and Thailand and so Thailand, yeah, but very little. And I think that now the map is changing. It's changed so profoundly. I mean, China is so important to Malaysia, much more important than the UK is. What the UK is just a sort of historical interest, and in terms of the shape of your electric plugs and so on. But I think that this is, yeah, it's very, very important, and it's very important that more Malaysians learn Chinese. I mean, this is would be not so difficult to say this to a Chinese Malaysian, but Malays and so on are very important, that because China is the most important country for, I guess now, for the future of Malaysia and the ASEAN countries in general. And the universities are getting better and better in China, and they're investing huge amounts of money in the universities. So, and if you look at the academic papers that are being produced now in many areas, especially the science and technical areas, Chinese, I don't know what the latest figures are, but China's such a big, so many Chinese are contributing to these now international journals. So yes, I mean, I would say definitely, depends on the subject, you know, obviously depends on the subject, but definitely, you know, go east, or in this case, go north, I suppose, is what I should say. And this is very, very important for, you know, if you're dealing with the Chinese, you need to know about the China. You know, if you're dealing with China, you need to know about China. How do you know about China? Well, there's the language, but also there's some immersion, there's some familiarity with it. It's extremely important. And so this is where young Malaysians should make this a very important priority.
Thank you, Prof. In fact, I would like to send my kids there too, but my kids are still pretty young at this point. But anyway, you just affirmed my thinking. Anyways, it's getting pretty late, so I will hand this back to Kok Keong to wrap up for the night.
Hi, Martin.
Oh, yeah,
I'm still here.
Yeah.
So
Yi Yan, and she is was a student at Fudan University.
Yeah.
A Malaysian who studied in China.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I just
would you like to just say a few things about that?
Okay, I have studied in China for like 7 years. So I have my SCPM, which is the higher education. So after that, I decided to go to Hangzhou, Zhejiang University. And after that, I have my master over there. So I have met Martin when he was there. So, you know, as a Malaysian, because I was like when go back to the questions of Mr. Wai Leong just now, I pretty encourage all the Malaysians, especially, it's not only Chinese or Malays that to go and study to abroad. But if you ask me about the futures, I would like to say that China is the futures. I mean, because I'm interested in China. So for me, I decided to come back and work with the government. I'm positive of everything that I've learned from the China side, just as what Martin just now has said. You have to be there. You have to learn to study with the Chinese students. They are experts, and they compete a lot. They are very in a very fierce competition, because as everyone has noticed that the Chinese students, they are all they has went to their examination, so they compete a lot, very strong to enter the Fudan University, Peking University, Tsinghua University. So all the institutions, I mean, the Chinese education is how to say is different. It's totally different compared to what we have learned in Malaysia. So you learn how to cope with the China peoples, and also I have my lecturers in Chinese lecture over there. You have to learn what is their language, although we speak Chinese, but actually it's different. The cultures is different, and the narrative is different, and how they work and how they think the outside world, for example, is how they think about US China or China US is totally different. For example, is how they think about US China trade war, how they actually look upon on like US, or how actually they react, especially how they react on other people's to on China's, like when you ask them, oh, okay, so what is actually US is looking on us, like why US is actually having this kind of news, or South Korea or Europe. So actually, to answer a lot of the question is actually China people, when you study over there, you communicate with them, you discuss with them, and a lot of the students, the Chinese students, they will give you a lot of their thought. It's actually, you couldn't get it from here. You actually have a lot of arguments between like the countries. It's actually China's, what is the difference between Malaysians Chinese and China Chinese? If I want to say this, actually China Chinese, they always think in a very macro view. They always think that on behalf of their country, they should work this, they should work that, and then they should work hard even better for the economics. They should compete with the US, the Europe, and they actually even more hardworking to actually look outside world. For example, I can actually tell you that a lot of the youngsters nowadays, they have the proxy in their phone. They check about Bloomberg, they check about everything. They are not only limited to their own world in China. They are thirsty and they are very hungry for outside world, including the politics, economics, and so on. So definitely, I would suggest, and maybe to encourage all many of the students in China, in Malaysia, to actually to pursue their educations maybe in the futures in China. This is maybe some of my comments.
Okay, thank you, Yiyun. Thank you very much. Okay, so Kok Kyung, would you like to take over?
Yes, thank you,
Okay.
Johnson. And also thank you to Yiyun again. What a wonderful way to wrap up the evening with such a refreshing comments about about your experiences in China. I'm sure that's very helpful. And I'm sure that all of us have enjoyed this session. Thank you to our speaker, Martin, for highlighting the disjuncture, right? And and how it impacts the rest of the world, US and China. From the disjuncture, from the discussion, maybe can we hope for a conjuncture or a conjunctive, right? I think that's the purpose, the end all and be all of our talks. So, Martin, if this was a physical lecture, I will ask one of the governors of the Academy to present a gift to you as a token of appreciation. But because this is a virtual hearing, I will send you a little gift, which is to be on its way, a publication from our Para Academy as a token of our appreciation. Thank you very much indeed for giving your time to address us in this session. And I also like to thank Tan Sri for introducing Martin, Ali Ten Boon, thank my co-moderator, Johnson Chong. And most of all, I'd like to thank everybody here, all those who have stayed behind, because we can have a speaker, but we also need an audience. So you need two to tango. It has been a very good session. We've shared a lot of views, and I hope to see you all again. And if I may just ask you all to show your appreciation by unmuting, and we all clap and show our appreciation to the speaker.
Okay, do you want to take photo?
Breakfast.
Great.
Fabulous, Martin.
Okay, yes. Those are well, yes, turn on the video and we'll have a picture.
Yes, I will do a screen capture to try and get everyone.
Picture.
Good. Smile, everybody. Give us the signal, Johnson. Commander.
Okay. All right. 1, 2, 3, smile. Okay. And I will share it with Kok Kyung, and perhaps we will share it with you all.
Yes.
Thank you.
So those who would like to stay back to chit chat, please do. But otherwise, thank you very much again. Good night. God bless you.
Okay, thank you.
Good night.
Good night, Martin.